Since, at least, the time of Christ, almost 2,000 years ago precisely, there has been a philosophical dispute in Western civilization between the nature of ethics, as best exemplified in the musings of the Golden Age Greeks 500 years before then, and the nature of morality, as best exemplified in the tomes of the early Christian church fathers some 200 to 400 years after. Both these concepts were pondered from the era of the earliest still extant historical records, some 4,500 to 5,000 years ago, and the conclusion seems to have been, from the very foundations of Uruk and Sumer, that morality was the law of the gods, obeyed without choice by all mankind, while ethics was the law of man, which every individual is free to obey or disobey as they will. This distinction between the law of the gods and the law of mankind was summed up distinctly enough, nearly 4,000 years ago exactly, by Babylonia's unification of Sumer and Akkad under the reign of Hammurabi, the great lawgiver. In the ancient texts, the distinction was tendered as being between Nam, Ugaritic cuneiform for destiny, and Nam-Tar, Sumero-Akkadian for fate. The difference between the law of the gods and the law of man was that the law of the gods was unalterable and predetermined, like the course of a celestial body traveling through the void of empty space, while the law of man was considered malleable. One could exert their own free will to conquer their fate, but the single destiny of all life was seen to be its inevitable demise. Incumbent with increasingly imperialist rulership, the earliest monotheism began to cohere around the Babylonian state deity Marduk, the slayer, according to later versions of the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation myth, of Tiamat, that is, an early concept of what we might consider now a dragon. The depictions of Tiamat are somewhat like the visage described in the Gnostic apocryphal text, the divine Pymander of Hermes the thrice greatest. Later explanations for the imagery of Tiamat and the divine Pymander associate both with the constellation Draco, which is wrapped around the North Pole star Polaris, with a portion of this constellation inside all 12 houses of the ecliptic planar zodiac round. This constellation is also believed to be the origin of the Hebrew concept of the tele, or an uncoiling bolo tether by which the planet is said to be suspended from Polaris. Confer ha-Kabbalistic Sefer Yetzirah. Now, just as in the Babylonian Enuma Elish, Tiamat symbolized the ultimate evil, Marduk was heroized as embodying the ideal good. Ultimately, it was reasoned, the happiness of the state god was the greatest good of the state, and that, for all citizens of a society, the greatest good for the sustainment of that society is the happiness of its citizens. The happiness of the state god was sustained by seasonal religious rituals, while the happiness of the citizens of the state was said to follow from their obedience to the legal codes of their state. By their golden age, 2,500 years before now, Greek thinkers were strongly questioning whether the legal codes of all previous states, the so-called ethical laws of man as a whole, had yet been capable of reflecting true goodness, which remained allocated solely to the moral laws of the gods. It was reasoned by the earliest formulators of a direct democracy that the greatest good possible in reality is pleasing some of the people all of the time, or else all of the people only some of the time. Or, in other words, the greatest good for everyone is whatever is best for the majority, or greatest percentage of the populace most of the time. This led to representative democracy, when the government bureaucracy became too large, and the result of this transition from one person, one vote on every issue to one group, one official voting on the issues on behalf of the minority contingents of their constituencies was that the majority were unseated as being the bearers of the greatest good, and instead the ruling elite or vocal minority were the only group that held real authority. Given consideration of these factors, the introduction between the Greek Golden Age around 500 BC and the start of the Roman Empire around 50 BC of Oriental philosophies, in particular the earliest diffusion of Buddhist teachings into Western civilization, posed a dilemma for the ruling elite. Buddha advocated unconditional charity from the rich to the poor, as had been the practice in the East since early Vedic times, and this conflicted with the imperialist enslavement-based economy cherished by the Western powers that be. In an attempt to discredit this philosophy of altruistic charity, the myth of the crucified martyr began to supplant that of the warrior lord as being the archetype associated with the savior deity and its incarnation on earth. The result was the New Testament Synoptic Gospels, canonized in the Latin Vulgate along with the writings of Roman loyal Jewish scribe Flavius Josephus. These works all presented anecdotal evidence that a world king had been born, had walked the earth, had taught disciples, and finally had been assassinated by the priestcraft and statists of his era. Many rejected this personage being a world king due to their expectation that the coming of such would correspond to bringing about the end of days and a cataclysmic destruction upon the planet, which, they reasoned, it had not yet done. By the time of the writing down of the Holy Koran, however, the person of Jesus of Nazareth had already largely been accepted by the indigenous peoples of the region as being their God's Son. And again, at this point in our story, we come to the splitting in Western civilization between the concept of God's ineffable plan, the morality of the Christian Church, and the fallibility of man's laws, the ethics of all individual people. Now, setting aside the topic of morality for a separate discussion, let us solely consider mankind's ethics, or what we believe constitutes a universally generalizable definition of right and wrong. Poets have variously associated the concept of what is ethically right and what is morally good as human rights with what is right now rather than what is left over as political wings, and with the practice of religious ritualistic rites. Again, we may discard from this discussion all consideration of moral good and evil as being the contents of a perpendicular axis to ethical right and wrong, but it may be occasionally useful to refer to them nonetheless. For example, it can be posited as a truism that one may do a wrong or an evil thing in a right or a good way. Thus, qualification adds nuance to these words' meanings that finally only confuses their original distinct intents. Likewise, just as one may do wrong rightly or do evil well, one may also do right wrongly or accomplish good poorly. These are all relativities on a chart that includes, at right angles, good and evil on a morality axis, and right and wrong on an ethical axis. However, again, it is possible to wholly divorce morality and ethics and separate them entirely. After all, one is the law of the gods, or of the one true God, and the other is based on the law of man, and this, in turn, is based on human intuitive instincts and deductive reasoning. In the absence of a higher power serving as a guiding light, an ultimate arbiter in all disputes, mankind's ethics are, at best, a hypocritical charade. We claim to advocate for the greater good, but in truth we reward whomever is most ruthless, most bloodthirsty, and most tactically cunning. These individuals, so cherished by historians, themselves do not have and have never had the good of the people at heart. Historical records recount a rough ratio of some 10 mighty conquerors to every one pacifist sage, or, in perhaps more familiar terms, 10 Nero-like Caesars to each Christian saint. Thus, even at this first step, we must pause to ponder if pursuing the premise of ethics is even possible at all, or if it is not a moot point and a dead end, being an impossible goal for us after all. Nevertheless, it is the goal of this essay to address some of the facets surrounding the concept of ethics, and to do so apart from those somewhat similar concepts of morality. So, ethics is comprised of a dual pair of extreme opposites. On the one hand, there is what is called right, and on the other hand, there is what is called wrong. First, we must define what is, or should be, held as universally right and wrong, and then we may consider how to determine between what is right and what is wrong on our own. Put simply, doing what is right means making the most informed choice and selecting the best possible option in any given situation. While in most situations it is difficult unto impossible to determine what the right choice will be, because one can rarely contemplate their options long enough to predict their final future outcomes, it is definitely possible to determine if one has made the wrong choice in hindsight. Generally speaking, what is right leads to what makes life easier, more enjoyable, and less distracting from idle, abstract thinking. What is right is, due to the scarcity of its being chosen at random, and due to the veneration of the lucky who do so, associated with wisdom. Thus, those lucky enough to hit a streak of right choices may be considered wise and successful winners in life, but everyone's luck runs out eventually. Many who are truly wise sages lead unpopular and unlucky lives, only to be venerated forever after their deaths. However, neither the truism that the successful are wise, nor that which states the unsuccessful are also sometimes wise, is totally axiomatic. In fact, wisdom and luck, or more exactly, acquired skill and innate talent, are both factors that, combined, form the better portion of success, or a streak of right choices. One of the chief debates over what is right in general is that between the ends and the means used to achieve that goal. Again, this is a qualitative nuance in the meaning of the premise. If the ends are right, can the means be wrong, and vice versa? In the former case, the ends are often said to justify the means, but in the latter example, this does not hold true. For example, doing right wrongly, that is, accomplishing good or right ends by evil or wrong means, may still be forgiven due to the recency of good over the primacy of wrong. On the other hand, in the second case, where one does wrong by doing right, it has been posited, in brief, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Just as much as morality may be tied to the heart and one's innate moral sense, assuming one is not an amoral sociopath. Ethics is tied to one's brain and one's common sense reasoning. As such, one who has a good heart can also have a dull brain, and thus accomplish much harm even while trying to do good. Likewise, someone who has a sharp wit but a heart of darkness may accomplish great deeds, benefiting all and improving everything, even if only on accident or in defeat. As has been said, the failings of tyranny are the successes of liberty, and so it is with right and wrong, that the failures of one are the victories of the other. So if one intends to choose right, but fails, their loss is a gain for all that is wrong with the world, and if one intends to choose wrong, but fails, their mistake may turn out to benefit the whole world. Thus there are intentions and accidents, means and ends, and even one's capacity for aptitude, to take into consideration in weighing out judgments of choices in media res as being right or wrong. Just as doing what is right makes one's survival easier, what is wrong is considered whatever is contrary to survival. If you prick us, do we not bleed? Has been proposed as a rationalization for the golden rule, that being, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Now, based on observation, this rule only works when you let the others know you could be treating them worse, but that you are choosing to treat them better. If they do not know this, they will take your kindness for weakness, and exploit and eventually harm you. Also, these others must know already or be made to understand that you are only treating them in that way in the hope they will reciprocate in like kind. Thus, the golden rule does not work on strangers nor in most situations. Whenever people are forced to play a role in a business transaction, then their manners improve to the same extent they deal face to face with strangers, such as with a sales clerk tendering change for a customer's purchase, and deteriorate to the same extent they deal behind a veil with others, such as with a telemarketer in a call center answering a helpline or making cold calls. However, in most cases, strangers do not behave in a business-friendly manner toward one another. Outside of diplomatic pacts, arranged marriages to profit land ownership expansions, and the day-to-day receipts for all the transactions of capitalism, people remain savages, worse even than the demons they imagine to blame their behaviors on, and forgive themselves by comparison to. The best demonstration for this is putting otherwise civilized and domesticated people into a straight line. While ordinarily we are accustomed to functioning in three-dimensional space, as soon as you drop a dimension down to a two-dimensional line, people become very confused and a very different animal altogether. In a line, there are always going to be two types of people. One, the type who is in front of you in line, who will always seem stupider and slower than you, and two, the type of person who is behind you in line, who will always seem angrier and more impatient than you. In truth, these are merely projections of our perception, but given the conditions of that situation, they manifest themselves as universally apparent archetypes regardless. Now, the presence of strangers, when in a line in society or when in a war on a battlefield, causes one stress and anxiety, and it is such stress that can lead to internalizing pain and thus to physical illness. Pain from injury, from disease, from aging, and or from overwhelming emotions is usually an indicator you have made a wrong choice. The gnawing chasm eroded inside one's core self-confidence by the regrets incumbent from a wrong decision is, by any measure, far worse than the giddy, fleeting, phantasmagoric fear over choosing what is right while it is still a possibility for you to do so. Knowing beforehand which choice is better or right, and which worse or wrong, is very, very, very difficult for most people alive today. We cannot usually say, if I choose this, these known outcomes will be likely to occur, so one is unable to add, therefore I must choose the one option that will lead to the best of all possible outcomes, because one cannot predict which option will lead to this best of all possible outcomes. In a line, such as while driving cars in traffic along a road, life is moving by too fast for us to rationally reason out every decision, and so we come to depend and rely a great deal more upon animalistic survival instincts than on informed and deliberate choices. Nevertheless, it remains possible, and, it is likely, may have been more common in some prehistoric phase of human life, that we can do our own investigative research and determine what the likely outcomes of any given choice will be, based on similar past experiences and observations. We can thus make the best possible or right choice. The only things preventing us from living in such a condition of constant mental awareness of this ethical plane of influence are the distractions of our everyday lives in society. Thus, it remains necessary for many, again, some of them may be wise, to escape the confines of society, the presence of strangers, and the pressure of their stressors, by turning toward the mysterious, the unknown, or the occult. By exploring these sort of realms and fields, be it on the earth, in outer space, or cyberspace, or inside the mind itself, these shy sages become psychic pioneers, staking claims in a new world of borderless opportunity. But retreat may only improve one's luck temporarily. One should not go to their cave without bringing something back that is useful to the whole tribe. In other words, if you improve your luck, but do nothing with it to benefit others, it will have been wasted on you. But if your luck improves and you do charitable and neighborly things for strangers, then may your fortunes last longer. It is said, one who has friends is never poor, because friends will help you when you falter. So it is too with choosing right over wrong and attaining social success. What we do for ourselves alone is fleeting. What we do for others, what we share with the world, will last forever. Or, put even more succinctly, life is short, art is long. To know good as distinct from evil is to have loved and lost, for your heart yet yearns to return to the source of your devotion, the forbidden fruit. We are told by myths that immortality is good, because it was fit for us in our youthful innocence, but is now denied us in favor of cursed free will. We are told that our relative foresight and ability to make accurate predictions is evil because death is all our only ultimate destiny, and that immortality would be infinitely better, but that we can never know the difference now, because for now we are mortal and cannot foresee the time our death will come. We are informed by our own five senses that nature is indifferent to our mythological projections of moral standards. We are ultimately unrestricted and, even within society, encouraged to lie, but all evidence indicates that, the more we soften reality beneath the focus of our will, the weaker its fabric becomes overall, until finally we must accept it as a zero-sum game. By controlling reality, we destroy reality. We understand by our consciousness, our sixth sense, our sense of self-awareness, that by accumulating past experiences we acquire the ability to more accurately predict outcomes. In order to do this, it is necessary to filter the raw data of environmental sense stimuli through the faculty of reason. The perimeter of the sixth sense is defined by the 6 fundamentals of ethical reasoning: who, what, when, where, why, and how. By using past experiences to make predictions, we learn the difference between good and evil. Good is a unit of positively charged karma in our surrounding environment that attracts alike positive and repels opposite negative karma. Both kinds of karma pass through our minds as thoughts. What constitutes a good deed? Positive karma is passive, allowing the cause of good coincidences to find you brings joy. Ideal good can be thought of as being absolutely pure and always existing for good only, neither containing, contiguous to, nor capable of conceiving of any impurity to this ideal. It is entirely uninformed of our own reality, wherein good is relative to evil. Ideal good must also be permanently unchanging, because to imagine it could be improved upon by change over time would mean it would also be capable of perceiving its past relative imperfection as evil, and thus its absolute continuity would disintegrate into relative good and evil. Thus, ideal good is not only alien from, but it must remain entirely unaware of our own reality. Relative good may be a degenerate form of ideal good, as some claim. However, ultimately this can never be proven, and thus it is irrelevant and unnecessary for our survival. In reality, relative good is the highest good that can occur. We can know ideal good as an idea in our minds, but only relative good can be done in reality, either by and for the self, or by and for the group. Ideal good informs us of the need for group utility, not only to achieve individual motives of social scale, but also to bring about benefit to the group as a whole. Thus, it should be obvious that the better good than that of the self is the good of the group. However, this is not the case. Instead, some believe the only good possible in reality is the relative good of the self, while others believe that, informed by ideal good, we can bring about the best good for ourselves only by doing what is best for the group. Because there are different beliefs about what is better, relative good for the self or the idealized good of the group, none should be believed. Instead, a third option based on a condition other than the self and or the group is most likely the most ideal relative good. Relative good means the good of the self is relative to the good of the group, but also that the more one views the interior self as good or evil, the more the exterior world of groups will appear the opposite, as evil or good. The good of the self is best for any self, but irrelevant to the good of any group. The good of any group is irrelevant to any self that is not a part of it. The good of the group is the good of the self for each member of that group. When a self seeks its own good, a group forms that seek the same good as that self. When a self seeks to do harm to itself, no group forms to follow it. When a group cooperates within itself, it more successfully competes with other groups that are less internally cooperative. If a group competes against its similars and cooperates with its opposites, it may compete skillfully, but cannot persist. If a group competes with its opposites and cooperates with other groups that share a similar good, it will be seen as the highest or greatest relative good by all. The highest or greatest relative good is the good of the self and or group that is most like the conditions for existence of the ideal good, despite that ideal good cannot exist inside reality. Rejecting the good of any groups and or the utility of relative good, a self does not need to either sacrifice nor espouse the utility of the self as an ideal good. To the self, the good of the interior self is the ideal good. However, relative to groups, in reality, the good of the self can only be done by and only by submitting to the good of groups. Affirming the good of all groups, and thus idealizing group utility, the self may dissolve its own good into relative good, but this is not the same as the ego dissolving into the ideal good. The utility of self, which is the good of all groups, is not the same as ideal good. Doing what is good for the group is not the same as good being done only for goodness's own sake. Neglecting the good of all groups, thus indifferent to reality, the ultimate good of the self is detached apart from it like ideal good. This does not mean the ideal good can be done in reality, even by ignoring the utility of self in groups and forgetting relative good in reality. The rejection of self-worth being group utility, and the impossible affirmation of ideal good being possible in reality, are neither an ideal nor relative good. Evil is a negatively charged unit of karma in our surrounding environment that attracts alike negative and repels opposite positive karmic particles that we focus on as thoughts in our minds. What constitutes an evil deed? Evil is active. Following such a negatively charged course of karmic coincidences to their source leads to regret. Ultimate evil is not the destructive obliteration, nor the negation and nullification, nor the transcendent unification of all reality. Ultimate evil is done for its own sake, but in reality, even this can accidentally do good. Ultimate evil must be, like ideal good, divided and entirely distinct from reality, wherein only evil relative to good exists. Ultimate evil is the destructive obliteration, the negation and nullification, and the transcendent unification of ideal good, and all the relative good of reality. Ultimate evil occurs when ideal good and relative good are compared, and reality is found the lesser. This implies that, just as reality is lesser than relative to idealism, there must be a greater evil relative to reality. Ultimate evil only negates ideal good. Ultimate evil does not require reality. Reality exists only in the moment, with no inherent residue of past history, and without any predetermined course for outcome. Reality is not a construct, like a game, a number matrix, nor a philosophical paradigm that can be controlled and its outcomes definitively predicted. Reality exists irrelevant of our projections upon it, of qualities and standards for good. In reality, there is only relative good and relative evil. In reality, there is no ideal good nor ultimate evil. Reality requires relative evil. Relative evil requires relative good. So good began being, and now is real. Just so, relative good requires relative evil. So evil began being, and now is real. Just as, in reality, relative good is the highest good that can occur, so too, in reality, is relative evil the worst evil that can be brought about. Just as we can imagine ideal good, but it must be distinct from reality, so too can we imagine worse evil than can possibly occur in present nature. Ideal good, by definition, cannot possibly exist in the presence of relative good. So relative good is real, and ideal good merely an idea in our minds. Ultimate evil is simply the absence of the idea of ideal good in the mind. A mind possessed by ultimate evil simply accepts relative good as the highest good, and rejects the ideal of relative good done for its own sake. Replacing ideal good with relative good recognizes ideal good only as the lesser of two evils, and asserts that if ideal good ever did, even only accidentally, discover reality's relative good, both forms of good would cease to exist, and all that would remain would be that third thing, the antithesis of both, the absence of all good, both ideal and relative. There are three conditions of the mind that arise following the acceptance of relative good as the highest possible good. Some individuals follow one path, and so some groups also follow that path, while some individuals follow another, and so some groups also follow the other path. However, just as the whole sum of all individuals in these three types of groups constitutes a single group collectively, that is, an aggregate population, so too are all three of these conditions present simultaneously in the individual mind of anyone in any of these three groups. Any self so possessed by the ultimate evil of relative good simply chooses one of these three groups to belong to, but is aware of and acts relative to the two other groups it rejects as well. First, the choice is made to forget. This means we choose to forget, choosing to forget. This does not mean we did not make the choice by and for ourselves. Having forgotten making the choice for ourselves, because we made the choice to forget having done so, is often used as an excuse for not taking personal responsibility and for individual fatalism. The first mental condition associated with diminished expectations is therefore a docile personality type, one psychologically trapped at the age and stage in personal development they had reached when they made the choice to forget. The choice to forget is usually made because of physiological trauma, because we associate such with evil, and then we choose to disassociate from this evil. Second, we project this fictitious morality, dubiously rationalized, onto the indifferent malleability of reality. By doing so, we assume the position of a moral high ground, which is, while socially accepted as applicable, purely illusory and self-inflicted. The result is the extreme psychological division between the interiorized ideal self and the exteriorized relative reality. The more one sees one as good, they will see the other as evil. This creates a high-pressure differential on the tensile karmic surface structure of our membranous plasma aura. Inwardly we are one person, while outwardly we are another, often very different from who we see ourselves as inside. This second mental condition tends toward high stress levels as the mood fluctuates rapidly from extreme high to low, cycling back and forth. Third, we find evidence to support our fictitious assertion. There are two types of the person who has reached this condition of mind following the compromise for a second best reality. A. One who believes in self-sacrifice to the group unto martyrdom for their cause. Or B. One who believes in self-aggrandizing and the absolute assumption of their assertion's validity. Both regardless of all factual evidence to the contrary. One who believes in self-sacrifice can be likened to a shepherd. while one who believes in self-aggrandizing can be likened to a goat herder. Each of these two groups has many names for the individuals in the opposite group, but do not give nor take on such titles to themselves. True gnosis, literally the study of knowledge, occurs when, by applying the 6 fundamentals of ethical reasoning to our sensory awareness of present tense, mutable reality, we learn from past experience how to apply our logical faculty to make more accurate predictions. In brief, gnosis means knowing good and evil, or, more precisely, being able to accurately foresee right and wrong. True gnosis is not the ideal good, but it is the highest or greatest good possible within a reality wherein good is relative to evil. True gnosis is good being done for the good of doing good alone. Truth is founded on facts. Whereas there are infinite possible facts, there is only one central truth. In the same manner, we see that any event, if viewed from multiple points of view by different observers at the same time, will be such a singularity, or rightly a monad, while the collection of all possible points of view, or facts, constitutes a plenum, or properly a divided line. However, if one could collect and combine all possible points of view, so-called facts, on any event, then its single truth, being the sum of all these facts, would remain infinitely less than the singular truth of all things. This is because, we are told, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Likewise, mythology explains to us, this is due to the certain ratio of the divided line being a proportion found throughout all nature. Lies are the opposite of facts, and fiction is the opposite of truth. There are 2 types of lie, little white lies and jokes. Little lies comprise all moral mythology. These are lies we believe safe and teach to our children. The concept of their being as pure as the driven snow in motivation derives from their social application, essentially altruism, being seen as like in quality to the conditions of existence of the ideal good. In other words, they comprise the selfless, group-oriented, greater relative good above the divided line. In-jokes are lies that can be spoken out in the open, or in the presence of a third party without them realizing the true context of what is being communicated. These comprise the quantity of symbolic value exchanged between economists, substituting money in all equations for timing. Thus, the proliferation of obviously intentional falsehoods comprises the plenum or spectrum of the lesser or lower aspect of the divided line. Fiction is made up of beliefs whose foundations did not turn out to have been based on facts. Instead of what is clearly good, having both foresight and long life, we are told by the perennial mythologies it is possible to have only one or the other. In other words, to have what is good, one can have none of what is evil, and likewise to have what is evil is ultimately to lack any and all capacity for ideal goodness. According to the fiction, we can't have it both ways. However, in the example they use, this is clearly not the case. Not only can we expand our own lifespans, no less so than contract them, we can also improve our own inherent clairvoyant abilities. These objects of such long luster in the mythopoeia, immortality and foresight, are, logically, irrelevant to one another. The ultimate truth is that ideal good can exist only within fiction. Ideal good can exist only as an idea in the mind, and thus it is separate from and unaware of the diminished good of reality. Relative good reflects the quality of ideal good, the best when applied by a group for the good of the group, and less than this by any individual for themselves, and following this by an individual for the group, and only least by a group for an individual. Reality is irrelevant to ultimate evil, which only negates ideal good, insofar as reality exists as the exteriorized environment of our aura, and insofar as the interior self is considered most like the ideal good, we can see that ideal good and ultimate evil are simply two halves of one whole, and that the substance of this monad is merely fiction itself. The tragedy of truth is that it is mistaken for being stranger than fiction. Because so many people believe in fictional novels, legends, and myths being historically accurate, factual accounts of reality. The truth is that no lie is a fact, and only facts describe reality. This simple rule is only stranger than fiction to those raised to believe fictions to be facts, lies to be truth, and reality to be strange and ultimately, on a divine level, entirely ineffable. A book isn't a non-fiction simply because it is a fact that the book, as a material object itself, exists. After all, consider the Bible. Among material objects made or used by the human species, there are generally three types: toys, tools, and weapons. Toys are the material objects that fascinate children and inspire them to imagine a brighter future. Tools are used by tradesmen to perform their duties in service of their own survival, as is all our right. Weapons are tools turned to the device of violence against our own kind, and to murder, and should not exist. If one is threatened with a stick, one may pick up a stone, and when threatened with injustice, one always has the right to bear their arms. But no aggression has ever been preemptively prevented by doing so, and doing so encourages, rather than peaceful survival, quite the opposite. Among methods of communication used by the human species, there are also, at least, three general types: intentional disinformation, counterfeiting or forgery, outright bald-faced falsehoods meant to mislead and misinform their target audience, novel fiction or little white lies, such as used by authors in creating a plotline and characters, even when using historical settings and real events as a backdrop for their imaginary fantasies. An indisputable, undeniable, materially objective, credible evidence of solid factual proof for the existence of a certain reality. If novel fictions or little white lies are like toys, and indisputable facts, or the whole truth and nothing but the truth, is like a tool, then lies, or pure fictions, are surely like weapons in the arsenal of humanity's instruments, used in the symphony of our own destruction. The conclusion I have drawn from this line of reasoning is this: the further a fictional novel strays from accounting actual facts about historical events that occurred in objective material reality, the less like a useful tool it becomes, and the more like a harmful weapon. This means the more a book strays from reality into the realms of pure fiction, the more a dangerous method for brainwashing and mind control it can become. Thus, if lies are harmful, then fiction is dangerous to the extent it is untrue. However, people impute truth to absurdly contradictory and illogical beliefs solely because it is human nature for us to be allowed to choose to do so. This process devalues the very meaningfulness of truth as a useful goal, worthy of desire for attainment. However, claiming that fiction is dangerous, or that certain novels may open portals better left closed, has earned me a great deal of resistant feedback from friends, peers, and others with whom I communicate. I believe this to result from my general observations in nature relative to the socializing conditioning undergone by the majority of the human species for the past 3 eons. If people had never accepted that some lies may prove true, the role of shaman would have atrophied at the point of the earliest proto-cities of the agrarian revolution. There would never have been a priest class, nor church, and no state would likely ever have been driven into war or competition with any other. The result of this line of reasoning leading me to my general opinion, however, has been public scorn and, often, personally directed disapproval. Who am I to question the beliefs of others? Is an all too easily invoked deflection tactic to defer from dealing with these logical arguments. I am only a person who quit reading fictions after having read all those writers considered classic authors of novel fiction. I have read the writings of those considered the best minds of their time and place for almost every nation in the modern world. My conclusion remains the same. Certain novels are dangerous, and my primary example remains the same: the so-called Holy Bible. The writings of modern novelists, such as Dan Brown and Tim LaHaye, I therefore see in the same light now as, perhaps some 3,000 to 2,000 years ago, the legends being compiled into what we now call the Holy Bible were seen by those Gnostic scholars and scribes who were tasked with recopying them, changing not one jot nor tittle, then. Seen in such a light, Tim LaHaye is denuded as a psychic predator, preying on the weaker-minded by offering them a false hope in an immoral rationale. Seen in such a light, Dan Brown is stripped down to be little more than a propaganda minister, promoting the softening of objective truth into an increasingly subjective substance as one goes further back across history's list of human events from their own present. Seen in such a light, the Torah is only a retelling of Gilgamesh. Seen in such a light, the right novel can summon a demon within oneself. The danger of fiction is in its enabling escapism. Thus, the greater degree of skill with which an author writes, the easier a reader may suspend their disbelief, and the more distant the audience's minds are allowed to wander, and hence, the more dangerous the novel fiction. This rule applies not only to this book here or that book there. It applies to all books ever written. They are either more fact and less fiction, or else they are more fiction and less fact. When they are the former, they are not a problem. Only when the latter case arises are people hypnotized into fantasy by them. For example, in his groundbreaking work Cypherpunks, WikiLeaks founder and persecuted journalist Julian Assange wrote of 3 layers of data, or the artifacts preserving our record of human existence. 1. The layer of useful, semi-public data. This includes all textbooks and non-fiction works. 2. The layer of recycling semi-public entertainment. Partially obscured as obsolete, this level refers to all forms of media that are promoted as purely fictional, diversion-motivated, and that make use of often repeating themes, so-called cross-cultural memes, such as in modern advertisements. And finally, 3. The layer of useful, privatized data, including suppressed historical records, censored or classified news events, banned books, etc. Now, this concept can cause no controversy among serious scholars because it is irrefutably accurate and its source honest. It is, therefore, by definition, a truth. However, it also remains the case in reality that truth is treason in an empire of lies. Regardless of whatever fairy tales we might like to try to convince ourselves or our children of, reality remains as it is. Some people are criminalized for honesty and accuracy, while others are rewarded for being puppets or pawns. This remains the hypocritical charade of human ethics today. We venerate lies and denigrate truth. Again, this is not a new trend. As scholars of world mythology have pointed out, the same mythic themes seem to prevail in all ancient cultures. Psychoanalyst Carl Jung called these archetypes of the collective unconscious. Joseph Campbell coined for them the perhaps more pointed term masks. Now we may identify them as stages within phases of the categorical development of what may be today called the human monomyth. These stages within phases of categorical development have been listed after copious globe-spanning studies by E.J. Michael Witzel in his work The Origins of the World's Mythologies. Before modernity, they would have simply been called the gods, for such they were, and as such they were the basis of all ancient myths. But what were or are these gods? They were often zoomorphic, but more usually anthropomorphic, ghostly essences that guarded over the various natural elements. At first there was Apsu, who was the watcher over all fresh water, but by the time of the writing of the Gnostic apocryphal Apocalypse of John, or Pistis Sophia, it was noted a post-resurrection Jesus taught of a unique guardian angel ruling over each bodily organ and every blade of grass. Here we come to the crux of this argument. Let it be questioned, finally, not what harm could come from such fantasies, but instead asked, what good has come from them? Accordingly, it is also quoted that man makes gods and then prays to them, when really it is the gods who should be praying to men. Theists will always lie. Religion is, after all, the greatest lie ever told. Theism requires lying to yourself, to your loved ones, to your children, to strangers, to the whole world. You personally do not know that such a thing as God exists. You take it on faith and the good word of kind strangers. But anyone who says they have seen God should be, rightly, regarded with skepticism, cynicism, and incredulity. People pray or talk to God all the time, in their minds, bouncing their own ego off the cavernous walls of their craniums, pretending that shadows and echoes are God's vision and voice. 90% of the human population talk to themselves this way, privately inside their own minds, as if thinking themselves to be in direct contact with the omnipotent divine. It is only their own imaginary friend, combined with culturally collective reinforcements of imagery. Originally, these totem spirits were encountered on entheogenic hallucinogens and mistaken for real entities occupying a higher plane of existence than our own mundane worldly reality. These otherworldly and alien beings seemed to endow people while under the influence of these drugs with paranormal and even supernatural powers, all of which, of course, wore off with the effects of the drugs. These early psychonaut mystics charted the terrain of an undiscovered landscape, but brought back nothing more from their astral adventures than presently mysterious megaliths and the mumbo-jumbo mishmash of the earliest myths. Ritual magic, perhaps once tied to the telekinetic erection of menhirs and henges, has long since become an empty practice, hallowing hand gestures and intonations of terms with no comprehension of their originally intended meanings. Likewise, religious ritual, that is, biblically sanctioned magic, is nowadays at best a song and dance meant to recall the trance once shared by these ancient shamans. However, religious ritual, too, has crumbled into misuse in modernity. This undoubtedly is Western civilization's fault, but it is too late to place blame, for now we must focus on cleaning up this mess before it causes more harm. This mess is the contemporary conspiracy of civilization, and, in particular, massive modern psychic empires. If this problem of psychic pollution is not cleaned up and the perpetrators of it not attended to as criminals, the telepathic communication system they flesh out the offices of will figuratively gangrene and literally worse, until ultimately the human genome will be patented and preserved in a seed bank, but the genetics in all human beings will mutate into new, less adaptive subspecies. The coming eon may be one of peace and prosperity for all life forms, or it may bring that catastrophic end of days long hoped for among the doubters. If we continue basing our plans for the future on patterns we established in the past, which were, we know now in the present, mistakes at best, then maybe humanity does not even deserve to survive the next inbound asteroidal impact.